I always thought elegance was about what you wore, how you carried yourself through the gilded salons of Milan. I spent years perfecting that image, the perfectly tailored dress, the confident stride through Via Monte Napoleone, the way I could command a room full of investors with just a smile and a well-placed word. But real elegance, I learned, isn't something you can design or purchase. It's what remains when everything else is stripped away, when the person you trusted most decides you're no longer worthy of respect. My name is Elena Rossi, and for nearly a decade, I built an empire in one of the world's most competitive cities. My design studio overlooked the Duomo, and my collections appeared in every major fashion week from Paris to New York. I was living what everyone called the dream. Success, recognition, a marriage that looked perfect in photographs. Matteo Santoro, my husband, was everything Milan society valued. Charming, well-connected, from an old Milanese family whose name opened doors I didn't even know existed. But there's something they don't tell you about dreams. Sometimes you're so busy maintaining the image that you forget to notice when it starts rotting from the inside. The first time Matteo made a joke about my work at a dinner party, I laughed along. It seemed harmless, just his way of being playful. "Elena works so hard, she barely remembers she has a husband," he'd say, and everyone would chuckle politely. I told myself it was endearing, that he was proud of me in his own way. I was wrong. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or a sudden revelation. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack in marble, until one day you realize the foundation you've been standing on has completely eroded. For months, maybe even years, I convinced myself that I was imagining things, that the subtle shift in his tone, the way his compliments started feeling like criticisms wrapped in velvet, was just the natural evolution of a long marriage. I remember the exact moment I knew. We were at Terrazza Triennale, one of those rooftop restaurants where Milan's elite gathered to see and be seen. The sunset painted the city gold, and I was wearing one of my own designs, a deep charcoal dress that had just been featured in Vogue Italia. I felt beautiful, powerful, exactly where I belonged. Matteo raised his glass to make a toast, and I expected the usual charm, the practiced affection he showed in public. Instead, he looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not quite contempt, the close. Close enough to make my chest tighten. "To my brilliant wife," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Though I have to wonder, darling, how long this little fashion empire of yours will actually last. Trends change so quickly, don't they?" The table fell silent. Someone tried to laugh nervously. I just smiled, my fingers gripping the stem of my wineglass so hard I thought it might shatter. That night, lying next to him in our bedroom with its view of the illuminated Duomo, I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a question I should have asked years earlier. When did I become someone he felt he could diminish? And more importantly, when had I started letting him? But that wasn't even the worst of it. The worst came later, at another dinner, another performance of our supposedly perfect life. What he said that night changed everything. It was the moment I stopped being a wife who hoped things would get better and became something else entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away before they expect you to. That night, I learned that revenge doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to stop playing a game where you were never meant to win. I paused that evening on our apartment terrace, looking out over the city that had witnessed my rise. The lights of Milan stretched endlessly, each one representing someone's ambition, someone's dream, someone's carefully constructed life. How do you dismantle a marriage to a man who's slowly been dismantling you for years, without losing yourself in the process? The morning after that first truly cutting remark at Terrazza Triennale, I woke up and went through my usual routine. Espresso in the kitchen, emails on my phone, the familiar rhythm of preparing for another day of meetings and fittings. But something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't quite name yet. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror as I was leaving. Perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup, the armor I wore every day. For the first time in years, I wondered who I was dressing for. My studio in the Brera district had always been my sanctuary. The high ceilings, the natural light pouring through the tall windows, the ordered chaos of fabric samples and sketches pinned to every available surface. My team of 6 designers and seamstresses knew me as demanding but fair, someone who pushed them because I pushed myself harder. That morning, my assistant Kiara noticed something was off immediately. She'd worked with me for 5 years and had developed an almost telepathic sense for my moods. "Everything all right, Elena?" she asked, bringing me my second espresso of the day. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. The truth was, I couldn't articulate what I was feeling. Anger would have been simple, clean, but this was something more complicated, a kind of hollow disappointment, like discovering that a painting you'd admired for years was actually a forgery. Everything about my marriage suddenly seemed suspect. All the moments I'd treasured now tainted with the question, was any of it real? Work had always been my refuge, and that day I threw myself into it with even more intensity than usual. We were preparing for Milano Fashion Week, and my latest collection, a series of pieces inspired by the architectural lines of the city itself, needed to be perfect. I spent hours adjusting seams, debating color palettes, losing myself in the creative process that had built my reputation. But even there, in the place where I'd always felt most myself, I couldn't escape the memory of Matteo's words, the casual cruelty in his voice. By midday, I realized something. I'd spent the entire morning in a kind of fog, going through motions that usually filled me with purpose. One of my junior designers asked for feedback on a jacket design, and I found myself staring at it for a full minute before I could focus enough to respond. This wasn't me. I'd built my business on precision, on being fully present for every decision, every detail. That's when I understood that Matteo's comment hadn't just hurt me. It had planted a seed of doubt about everything I'd accomplished. And doubt, in a city like Milan, where confidence is currency, can destroy you faster than any business failure. I left the studio early that afternoon, something I almost never did, and walked through the Navigli district. The old canals reflected the autumn sky, and tourists wandered with their cameras, while locals sat in cafes arguing about football. I needed to think, to figure out who I was outside of other people's perceptions. When I got home that evening, Matteo was already there, unusual for him. He was on the phone in his study, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite hear. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, looking at the space we shared, and felt like a stranger in my own life. Everything was exactly as it should be. The modern furniture we'd chosen together, the art we'd collected, the view that cost a fortune every month. But none of it felt like mine anymore. He came out eventually, smiling that same charming smile that had first attracted me 10 years ago. He kissed my cheek as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't humiliated me in front of a table of people the night before. "How was your day, Cara?" he asked, and I realized he genuinely didn't think he had done anything wrong. That was somehow worse than if he'd been deliberately cruel. It meant he'd stopped seeing me as someone whose feelings mattered. I told him it was fine. Work was busy, the usual response. We had dinner together at our dining table, making small talk about his day at his consulting firm, about mutual friends, about nothing important. I watched him as he talked, really looked at him, and tried to pinpoint when this had started. When had his pride in my success turned into resentment? When had his support become undermining? That night, lying in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, wasn't going to demand explanations or try to fix whatever had broken between us, because I realized something crucial. You can't fix what someone else has chosen to destroy. Instead, I was going to watch, wait, pay attention to the things I'd been too busy or too trusting to notice before. Sometimes the hardest part of seeing the truth isn't the truth itself. It's admitting how long you've been choosing not to see it. What else had I been missing while I was so focused on maintaining the perfect image of our life together? The signs, once I started looking, were everywhere. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice patterns I'd dismissed before. The way Matteo would check his phone obsessively during dinner, then claim it was just work. The unexplained late nights that had somehow become routine. The expensive purchases he made but never seemed to discuss with me. A new watch, custom suits, membership at an even more exclusive club than the one we already belonged to. But more than the tangible things, it was his attitude that had shifted. At another dinner party, this time at the home of Giulia and Roberto Ferretti, old friends who'd been at our wedding, Matteo found another opportunity to diminish me in public. Giulia had been complimenting my latest collection, saying how she'd seen it featured in Elle, and Matteo interrupted with a laugh that sounded almost affectionate but wasn't. "Elena does love her little projects," he said, swirling his wine. Though honestly, the fashion industry is so saturated now. Everyone with a sketchbook thinks they're the next Armani. The way he said it made my work sound like a hobby, something I did to keep myself occupied rather than the business that had been profitable for 7 consecutive years. Giulia's smile froze. Roberto looked uncomfortable. I felt heat rise to my face, but kept my expression serene. The old Elena would have laughed it off, made a self-deprecating joke to ease the tension. The new Elena, the one who'd started paying attention, simply smiled and said nothing. I'd learned something important. Sometimes silence is more powerful than any defense. Let him fill the awkwardness with his own words. Let people see exactly what he was doing without me having to point it out. On the drive home that night, Matteo seemed pleased with himself, humming along to the radio. I stared out the window at Milan passing by in blurs of light and wondered what had happened to the man I'd married. Or maybe the better question was, had he always been this way and I'd just been too in love, too hopeful, too invested in the fairy tale to notice? "You're quiet tonight," he said, glancing over at me. There was something in his tone, a kind of satisfaction, as if he enjoyed watching me withdraw. I realized then that this was a pattern. He'd make these cutting remarks, and when I didn't fight back, when I stayed calm and composed, it somehow disappointed him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to crack. "Just tired," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "It's been a long week." He nodded, apparently satisfied with that answer, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. When we got home, he went straight to his study, closing the door behind him. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood on our terrace, looking out at the city I'd conquered professionally, but had somehow failed to protect myself in personally. That's when I started to really investigate, not in some dramatic, cinematic way. I didn't hire a private detective or go through his phone like they do in movies. I simply started paying attention to the details I'd been too busy to notice before. I looked at our joint bank statements and saw transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. I noticed the names in his calendar that never matched the business meetings he claimed to be attending. The more I looked, the more the picture came into focus. Matteo wasn't just belittling me in public for sport. He was building a separate life, one where I was increasingly irrelevant. The disrespect was preparation, I realized. He was systematically devaluing me in our social circle, making sure that when whatever he was planning finally came to light, people would already have doubts about me, about my competence, about whether I really deserved my success. It was calculated, methodical, and honestly, impressive in its cruelty. I sat there on the terrace, the October air starting to turn cold, and felt something harden inside me. Not anger exactly, though that was there too. It was clarity. The kind of clear-eyed understanding that comes when you stop making excuses for someone and finally see them exactly as they are. I finished my wine, went inside, and started making notes. If Matteo was building a case for why our marriage should end with him on top, then I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I owed it to myself to be just as methodical, just as calculating. Because if this marriage was going to end, and somewhere deep in my gut I knew it was, then I was going to make sure I wasn't the one left with nothing. The game had changed. I just wasn't sure yet if he realized I'd started playing. How do you prepare for a battle when your opponent doesn't even know you've recognized it's war?
The dinner that changed everything happened 3 weeks later. It was mid-November, and Matteo had insisted we host a dinner party at our apartment. I should have questioned why. He usually preferred restaurants where he could make an entrance, but I was still in observation mode, watching, gathering information. So I agreed, hired caterers, made sure everything was perfect. The guest list was revealing in itself. His business partners, people from his social circle, but notably few of my actual friends. Chiara, my assistant, wasn't invited, despite being at dozens of our previous gatherings. Neither was Paolo, my business partner. It was clear this wasn't a social occasion. It was a stage, and I had a feeling I knew what role I was supposed to play. The evening started well enough. Our apartment looked spectacular, lit with candles and the glow of the city below. I wore one of my designs, a deep gold dress that complemented the autumn evening. I played the perfect hostess, making sure glasses stayed full, guiding conversation, being exactly what Milan society expected of Elena Rossi. But I noticed Matteo watching me with a strange expression, something almost like anticipation. Dinner was served, a beautiful risotto followed by ossobuco, traditional Milanese elegance. The conversation flowed around topics of business, politics, the usual repertoire of wealthy Italian discourse. Then, between the main course and dessert, Matteo tapped his wine glass for attention. My stomach tightened. I knew, somehow, that whatever was coming wouldn't be good. "I want to make a toast," he said, standing at the head of the table. Everyone turned to him with polite smiles. "To my beautiful, ambitious wife, Elena." He raised his glass, and I felt the room waiting. "She's built quite an impressive little business, hasn't she? Though I have to say, I've been thinking lately about whether this intensity is really sustainable long term." The room had gone silent. I kept my face perfectly composed, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. He continued, his tone light, but with an edge that everyone at the table could hear. "Marriage is about partnership, about balance, and I realized I need to be honest. I'm not sure our partnership is working the way it should." Someone shifted uncomfortably. I could feel all eyes moving between us. He took a sip of wine, seeming to enjoy the moment. "So, here's what I propose. Let's give it a year, 12 months, to see if this marriage is really worth continuing. By next November, we'll both know if this is something we want to maintain or if it's time to, well, pursue other options." The silence that followed was deafening. He just announced, in front of a room full of people, that our marriage had an expiration date, that I was on trial, being evaluated like one of his business ventures. The humiliation was exquisite and calculated. This wasn't a moment of honesty. It was a public execution. But something had happened to me over the past few weeks of watching and waiting. Where I might have once felt shock or shame, I felt instead a kind of icy calm. I saw the whole picture clearly now. This wasn't about our marriage at all. This was about control, about positioning himself as the one who decided our fate while making me look like the problem. I stood up slowly, every eye in the room on me. I could have cried, could have argued, could have done exactly what he expected. Instead, I smiled, genuinely smiled, and looked directly at him. The room held its breath. "That's an interesting proposal, Matteo," I said, my voice steady and clear, "but I have a better idea." I paused, letting the moment stretch. Why wait a year? The look on his face was worth every moment of pain he'd caused me. Confusion flickered across his features, then something close to panic. He'd expected devastation, maybe anger, certainly not this. Not me taking control of the narrative he'd so carefully constructed. I mean, if you're not sure about our marriage, why draw it out? I continued, still smiling that calm smile. Let's be honest with each other and with our friends here. This hasn't been working for a while, so why waste 12 months pretending otherwise? I picked up my wine glass, raised it to him in a mock toast, to honesty, I said, and to knowing when it's time to end something that's already broken. I drank, set the glass down with a gentle click, and then, in the most powerful move I could make, I simply turned and walked out of my own dining room, leaving a table full of shocked guests and one very stunned husband behind. I grabbed my coat and my purse from the bedroom and I left, not in tears, not in rage, but with the kind of dignity that comes from finally refusing to participate in your own humiliation. I walked out of that apartment into the November night, and I felt, for the first time in months, like myself again. The thing about setting yourself free is that nobody can do it for you. You have to be the one to open the door and walk through it. What would I find on the other side of a marriage I just decided to end?
I spent that night at the Bulgari Hotel, a luxury I normally would have considered excessive, but I needed space where I felt like myself, surrounded by beauty and quality. I turned off my phone after seeing 17 missed calls from Matteo and checked into a suite overlooking the botanical garden. For the first time in years, I was completely alone with my thoughts, no performance required. The reality of what I'd done hit me around 2 a.m. I had essentially ended my marriage in front of a dinner party, walked away from the apartment I loved, and done it all on impulse. The old Elena would have been terrified, but as I sat there in the dark, looking out at Milan's night sky, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Bone-deep, overwhelming relief. I'd been holding my breath for months, maybe years, and I'd finally exhaled. The next morning, I called my attorney, Francesca Moretti, someone I'd worked with on business contracts, but had never imagined I'd need for personal matters. "I need to see you today," I said. "It's urgent." Her office was in a beautiful building near the Duomo, all dark wood and leather-bound law books. She took one look at my face and poured us both an espresso. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. The public humiliation, the pattern of belittling comments, my decision to end it rather than endure his year-long evaluation period. She listened without interrupting, making notes in her elegant handwriting. When I finished, she looked at me with something like admiration. "Elena, that was either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the most impulsive," she said. "Fortunately for you, Italy's divorce laws don't require you to stay in a bad marriage just because you're married to someone with a famous family name." Then her expression turned serious. "But we need to be smart about this. The Santoro family has connections, money, and probably lawyers who've been planning for something like this." That's when she asked the question that would change everything. "Do you have access to your financial records? All of them?" I nodded. We'd kept joint accounts, and I'd never thought to hide anything from Matteo. But then she asked, "What about his records, his business accounts?" I realized I didn't actually know much about Matteo's business dealings. He worked in consulting,
advised wealthy families on investments, managed portfolios. I'd never questioned it because he'd always presented it as successful, legitimate, respectable. But Francesca's question made me think about those unexplained transfers I'd noticed, the accounts I didn't recognize. "I want you to gather every financial document you have access to," Francesca said. "Bank statements, investment records, anything with both your names on it. And Elena," she looked at me seriously, "if you're going to end this marriage, you need to know exactly what you're walking away from, or what might be taken from you." I spent the next 2 weeks living in that hotel suite, working from my studio during the day, and in the evenings, meticulously going through years of financial records. I accessed our joint accounts online, printed statements, organized everything chronologically. And that's when I started to see the pattern. Money was moving in ways that didn't make sense. Large transfers marked as business investments that never appeared on any official documents. Payments to offshore accounts, consulting fees from companies that, when I searched for them, barely seemed to exist. Matteo had been careful, but not careful enough. Either that, or he'd never imagined I'd actually look. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became my husband wasn't just a successful consultant. He was running something closer to a sophisticated fraud scheme, using his family name and connections to move money for clients who needed discretion, the kind of discretion that usually means they're hiding something. No wonder he'd wanted me on trial for a year. He'd needed time to ensure everything was untraceable before the inevitable divorce. I took everything to Francesca. She studied the documents for hours, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or concern. Finally, she looked up at me. "Elena, this is bigger than a divorce. What you found here, if it's what I think it is, this is fraud, money laundering. This could destroy him." The weight of that hit me hard. I'd been focused on protecting myself, on making sure I didn't lose everything I'd built. But this was different. This was evidence of criminal activity, and I was sitting on it, trying to decide what to do. Francesca could see the conflict on my face. "I know what you're thinking," she said gently, "that revealing this would make you the villain, the vindictive ex-wife. But, Elena, he put you in this position. By keeping joint accounts, by involving you financially in his business, he made you potentially complicit. If this comes out and you knew about it, you could face consequences too." She was right. My silence wasn't just about revenge or protection. It was about my own legal survival. I had a choice: report what I'd found to the authorities or use it as leverage in the divorce. Either way, the man I'd married was about to face consequences he never anticipated. I went back to my hotel that night, ordered room service I barely touched, and thought about the woman I'd been when I married Matteo 10 years ago. She believed in love, in partnership, in building a life together. Somewhere along the way, that woman had been slowly dismantled by someone who saw her success as competition rather than celebration. But she was coming back, piece by piece, and she was stronger now, more careful, infinitely more aware of exactly what she was capable of when pushed too far. The question wasn't whether I would use what I'd found, it was how. Is protecting yourself from someone's crimes the same as becoming their enemy, or is it just finally becoming your own ally? December arrived with cold rain and the kind of gray skies that made Milan feel simultaneously romantic and melancholic. I still hadn't returned to the apartment. Matteo had sent countless messages, first angry, then conciliatory, then vaguely threatening. His lawyer had reached out to Francesca, suggesting we discuss this privately before things escalate. I knew what that meant. They wanted to control the narrative, make sure whatever divorce agreement we reached would protect him. But I wasn't ready to negotiate. I was still gathering evidence, still building my case, still deciding exactly how I wanted this to play out. Because I'd realized something crucial. I had more power in this situation than Matteo understood. He saw me as the wronged wife, emotional and vulnerable. He had no idea I'd found his carefully hidden accounts, his fraudulent transactions, his entire secret operation. My business, meanwhile, was thriving. Milano Fashion Week had been a triumph. My collection received standing ovations, orders from major retailers, features in every significant publication. It was ironic, really. While my personal life was collapsing, my professional life had never been stronger. Or maybe it wasn't ironic at all. Maybe I'd finally stopped dividing my energy between being someone's wife and being Elena Rossi, designer and businesswoman. Chiara had noticed the change in me. "You seem different," she said one afternoon while we were reviewing designs for the spring collection. "More focused, more," she searched for the word, "present." I smiled at that. Present, yes. For the first time in years, I was fully in my own life, rather than performing in someone else's story of what my life should be. I met with Francesca again in mid-December. We sat in her office, the winter light gray through the windows, and she laid out my options with her characteristic directness. Option 1, we file for divorce, use the evidence you found as leverage to ensure you get a fair settlement. He'll likely pay whatever you want to keep this quiet. Option 2, we report what you found to the financial police, and the divorce becomes secondary to a criminal investigation. And option 3, I asked, because with Francesca, there was always a third option. She smiled slightly. Option 3 is what I call the strategic reveal. We start the divorce process normally, make it seem like a standard separation, but we file certain documents with the court as part of the financial disclosure, documents that, by law, become public record. We're not reporting him directly, we're simply being thorough and honest in our legal filings. I understood immediately. The information would come out as part of normal divorce proceedings, but it would be public, accessible to anyone who cared to look. Journalists, investigators, his business partners. It wouldn't be me destroying him. It would be the natural consequence of his own actions becoming visible. How long would it take, I asked, for the information to surface? Francesca considered. In a normal case, a few weeks, but this is Milan and the Santoro name means something. People will be watching this divorce. I'd estimate that within days of filing, someone, a journalist, a competitor, maybe one of his nervous clients, will start digging into the financial documents we've submitted. It was elegant, really. Clean. I wouldn't have to actively destroy him. I just had to stop protecting him. Stop keeping his secrets. Stop being complicit in the illusion he'd created. The truth would do the rest. Christmas approached, and the city transformed into something magical. Lights strung across streets, Christmas markets in the piazzas, the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine everywhere. I'd always loved this time of year in Milan, but this Christmas felt different. I was alone, yes, but also free. I'd rented a smaller apartment in the Porta Venezia district, modern and elegant, but entirely mine. No shared memories, no spaces that echoed with old arguments. On Christmas Eve, I got an unexpected visit at my studio. Matteo somehow talked his way past building security, or, more likely, bribed someone. I looked up from my desk to find him standing in the doorway, and for a moment, I saw the man I'd married. Not the cruel version of the past year, but the charming, handsome man who'd made me believe we could build something beautiful together. "Elena," he said, and his voice had that quality it used to have, warm and sincere. "Can we talk, please?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk, my face neutral. He sat down, and I could see he'd prepared for this, rehearsed what he wanted to say. "I know I've been terrible. I know I've hurt you. That dinner party, I don't know what I was thinking. I panicked, I think. Your success, it made me feel," trailed off. "Small," I suggested, my voice quiet. "Yes, small, irrelevant. Like I was just Elena Rossi's husband, not Matteo Santoro. And instead of being proud of you, instead of celebrating what you'd build, I tore you down. I see that now." He reached across the desk like he wanted to take my hand, but I kept mine folded in my lap. "I want to fix this," he continued. "I want us to start over. No year-long trial, no tests, just us, the way we used to be." He looked at me with those eyes that once made me feel like the most important person in the world. "Come home. Come back to the apartment. We can spend Christmas together. Remember why we fell in love." It was a good performance. Maybe it was even genuine. I couldn't tell anymore. But I'd spent weeks uncovering his secrets, understanding the depth of his deception, and I knew something he didn't. There was no going back. Not after what I'd found. Not after what I'd decided to do. "Matteo," I said gently, "do you know what the hardest part of all this has been?" He shook his head, waiting. "It's not the public humiliation or the cruel comments. It's realizing that I don't know if you ever really loved me, or if you just loved the idea of me, until that idea became threatening instead of flattering." His face changed, the mask slipping slightly. "That's not fair, Elena. I've always loved you." But I could hear the lie in it now, the hollow ring of words that meant nothing. I stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Milan preparing for Christmas. "Maybe you did in your way, but love isn't supposed to make you smaller. It's supposed to make you more yourself, not less." I turned to him. "I'm filing for divorce after the holidays. My lawyer will contact yours. I suggest you consult with your attorney about how you want to proceed." His expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what you're walking away from." I smiled at that. Actually smiled. "No, Matteo, I know exactly what I'm walking away from. That's why I'm walking." He left, and I locked the door behind him. Through the window, I watched him walk down the street, his shoulders tense with anger or fear, or both. The old Elena would have doubted herself, would have wondered if she was being too harsh, too unforgiving. The no Elena poured herself a glass of wine, sat at her desk, and felt nothing but certainty. The truth was coming, whether he was ready or not. Do you mourn the end of a marriage, or celebrate finally seeing clearly enough to know it needed to end?
If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next chapter of life, love, and redemption. The paperwork was filed on January 7th, just after the Epiphany holiday, when Milan slowly returned to work. Francesca submitted all the necessary documents to the court, including the comprehensive financial disclosure that, by law, had to detail all marital assets, accounts, and transactions. Everything we'd found, every suspicious transfer, every offshore account, every questionable business investment, was there in black and white, part of the public record. It took less than 48 hours. A financial journalist named Marco Bellucci, known for his investigations into Milan's Elite, accessed the court filings and saw what we'd laid out so carefully. By the evening of January 9th, the first article appeared online. Santoro Consulting under investigation. Divorce documents reveal possible fraud. I was at my studio when Chiara showed me the article on her phone. I read it carefully, my face composed, though my heart was racing. The piece was thorough. Marco had taken our financial disclosures and followed the trail, connecting dots, reaching out to some of Matteo's clients, finding others who'd apparently been wondering about similar irregularities. The word fraud appeared 6 times, money laundering 3 times. My phone started ringing immediately. Friends, concerned. Business associates, curious. My mother, calling from Rome, frantic. I let most of them go to voicemail, but I did answer when Francesca called. "Have you seen it?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. "Elena, this is going to get bigger. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around my studio, at the evidence of everything I'd built through my own work, my own vision. "I'm prepared," I said. She was right about it getting bigger. Within days, more journalists picked up the story. The financial police, Guardia di Finanza, opened an official investigation. Some of Matteo's clients, panicking about their own exposure, started making statements to protect themselves. The carefully constructed facade of Matteo Santoro, respectable consultant from an old Milanese family, crumbled with astonishing speed. The response in our social circle was predictably divided. Some people blamed me, calling me vindictive, saying I'd destroyed him out of spite. Others, more than I expected,
reached out quietly to say they'd always suspected something was off, that they admired my courage. Julia Ferretti, who'd witnessed that awful dinner party, called me one evening. I should have said something that night when he made that proposal, that year-long trial of your marriage. It was cruel, Alina. I'm sorry I didn't speak up. It's all right, I told her, and I meant it. I had learned something important through all of this. You can't expect other people to defend you. Sometimes you have to be the only one brave enough to say enough. But what surprised me most was the number of women, wives of Matteo's business associates, women I had known socially for years, who contacted me privately. Thank you, one of them wrote in a message, for showing that we don't have to accept being diminished. Matteo, meanwhile, was fighting back through his lawyers in the press. He gave an interview to a sympathetic journalist, painting himself as the victim of a vengeful wife who couldn't handle the end of their marriage. Elena is an ambitious woman, he said in the article, and I always supported her career. But when I suggested we honestly assess our relationship, she turned it into a weapon against me. Reading that, I felt a flicker of the old anger, but mostly I felt pity. He genuinely seemed to believe his own version of events, where he was the reasonable one and I was the irrational, emotional woman. He couldn't see, or refused to see, that none of this would have happened if he hadn't built his success on fraud and deception. I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply stopped hiding his destruction from view. By the end of January, the investigation had expanded. More clients came forward. More transactions were uncovered. The full scope of what Matteo had been doing became clear. He'd been running what amounted to a private bank for wealthy individuals who needed to move money discreetly, charging enormous fees while cutting corners on legal requirements. It had made him rich, but it had also made him vulnerable. His family, the Santoros, with their old name and older money, distanced themselves quickly. A statement from his father's attorney made it clear that Matteo Santoro's business dealings were conducted independently and do not reflect the values or practices of the Santoro family. It was a public disavowal, cutting him loose to save their own reputation. I wondered if that hurt him more than the investigation itself. Through it all, I focused on my work. My spring collection needed to be finalized, new orders fulfilled, meetings with buyers and investors maintained. I couldn't afford to let the drama of the divorce and investigation derail what I'd built. If anything, I worked harder, stayed later, poured every ounce of energy into proving that Elena Rossi existed completely independent of her soon-to-be ex-husband. One evening in early February, I was working late at the studio when I got an unexpected visitor. Marco Bellucci, the journalist who'd broken the story, showed up with a request. Would I give an interview? I'm writing a longer piece, he explained, about women in Milan's business community, about power dynamics in these elite marriages. Your story, what you did, it's remarkable. I considered it. Part of me wanted to stay silent, let the facts speak for themselves. But another part, the part that had learned to take up space, to refuse to be diminished, wanted to speak. On one condition, I told him, this isn't a story about revenge or a bitter divorce. It's about recognizing when a relationship has become destructive and having the courage to end it. He agreed. The interview ran 2 weeks later in a major Sunday magazine. Elena Rossi, building an empire while dismantling a marriage. I'd been careful in what I said, focusing on my work, my company, my journey as a designer, rather than the details of Matteo's crimes. But the message was clear. I'd chosen myself, chosen my truth, chosen freedom over the comfortable lie of a failing marriage. The response was overwhelming. Messages from women across Italy, some sharing their own stories of leaving difficult marriages, others just saying they understood. My business didn't suffer. If anything, it grew. Clients seemed to respect that I'd stood up for myself, that I hadn't let personal turmoil destroy professional excellence. By March, Matteo was facing criminal charges. His passport was revoked, his assets frozen. The year-long trial he'd proposed for our marriage had been replaced with an actual trial, his, in a courtroom, facing consequences he never imagined when he'd casually humiliated me at that dinner party. Sometimes I thought about that evening, about the moment he'd announced his plan to evaluate whether I was worth keeping. I wondered if he ever thought about it now, sitting in his lawyer's office, preparing his defense. The divorce itself was moving forward separately. With his assets frozen and his reputation destroyed, there wasn't much to fight over. I wanted nothing from him. Not his money, not his family's name, nothing. I just wanted it to be over, to close this chapter and move forward. Francesca was handling everything with her usual efficiency, and she predicted we'd be officially divorced by summer. One night in late March, I stood on the terrace of my new apartment, smaller than the one I shared with Matteo, but entirely mine, and looked out at Milan. The city lights stretched endlessly, beautiful and indifferent. I'd lost a marriage, gained a reputation as someone not to cross, and somehow emerged more myself than I'd been in years. It hadn't been revenge I'd wanted, really. I'd just been wanting freedom. And I'd found it piece by piece by refusing to keep his secrets and choosing to keep my dignity instead. When you finally stop protecting someone who never protected you, who do you become?
Spring arrived in Milan with its usual dramatic beauty, wisteria blooming purple along old buildings, outdoor cafes filling with people, the entire city seeming to exhale after winter. I'd been divorced for exactly 3 weeks when I made a decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I was going to expand my business in a way I'd been too cautious to attempt before. For years, I'd kept my company deliberately small, exclusive, limited production, high prices, a careful brand that spoke to Milan's elite. But watching my marriage collapse and my ex-husband face consequences for his choices had taught me something crucial. Playing small to make other people comfortable doesn't protect you. It just makes you smaller. I sat down with Paolo, my business partner, and Chiara, my right hand, and laid out my vision. We'd expand internationally, not just selling to boutiques in Paris and New York, but opening our own flagship stores. We'd add a more accessible line alongside our high-end pieces, bringing my design aesthetic to a broader market. We'd build something that could last, grow, evolve. It's ambitious, Paolo said carefully, always the cautious one. It's risky. I smiled at that. So was walking out of my own dinner party and divorcing someone connected to half of Milan's elite families. But here we are. He laughed, nodded. Fair point. Let's do it. And just like that, we started building something new. The first Elena Rossi boutique opened in the Quadrilateral della Moda in June, perfectly timed for Milan's summer fashion season. It was everything I'd envisioned. High ceilings, natural light, architectural lines that echoed both classic Milanese elegance and modern minimalism. The opening party was covered by every major fashion publication, and the store was profitable within its first month. But more than the business success, what struck me was how different I felt. The old Elena had always been good at her work, but there'd been a kind of restraint, a voice in the back of her mind questioning whether she deserved all the success, whether she was taking up too much space. That voice sounded suspiciously like Matteo. The new Elena had no such voice. She made decisions quickly, confidently, unapologetically.
Matteo's trial began in July. I didn't attend. I had no desire to see him in that context, to watch his public humiliation, but I couldn't help following the news coverage. Witness after witness described his fraudulent schemes, the promises he'd made and broken, the money he'd moved illegally. His defense was weak. He claimed he'd been misled by his clients, that he hadn't understood the full implications of the transactions. Nobody believed him. The evidence was too clear, too well documented. In August, he was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. The sentence was significant: 6 years in prison, heavy fines, permanent prohibition from financial services work. His life as he'd known it was over. The Santoro name, which had opened so many doors for him, was now permanently tainted. I didn't feel triumph when I heard the verdict. Honestly, I felt very little. It was like hearing news about someone I'd once known but no longer had any connection to. The man I'd married had ceased to exist years ago. Maybe he never really existed at all, and I'd just been in love with the carefully crafted image. Either way, his fate was no longer my concern. What did concern me was building the life I actually wanted. Through late summer and into fall, I worked constantly. A second boutique in Rome, a collaboration with a major Italian textile manufacturer, negotiations for a store in New York's Soho district. Every morning I woke up in my apartment, made my espresso, and felt grateful for the silence, the space, the freedom to be exactly who I was without editing myself for someone else's comfort.
My social life shifted too. Some of the old couples-focused friendships faded away, people unsure how to maintain relationships when the couple unit broke apart. But new friendships emerged. Other businesswomen in Milan, artists, designers, people who valued work and passion and independence. I discovered I preferred dinners with interesting people discussing ideas to the endless social performances of the elite marriage circuit. In October, almost exactly a year after that devastating dinner party, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Matteo, forwarded through Francesca. He was writing from prison, and his tone was different than anything I'd heard from him before, stripped of charm and defensiveness, just raw and honest in a way that was almost painful to read. "Elena," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, but I've had a lot of time to think, really think, not the surface-level reflection I've always done to avoid uncomfortable truth. You were right about everything. I was threatened by your success. I did try to diminish you, and I built my entire professional life on deception because I didn't believe I could succeed through honest work the way you did." He continued, "What happened at that dinner party, announcing the year-long trial of our marriage, that wasn't some spontaneous moment of honesty. It was planned. I'd been having an affair for months, and I thought if I made you look unstable, made our friends question your judgment, it would be easier to leave you and still maintain my reputation. I was setting the stage to make you the problem so I could be the victim." I read this part twice, absorbing the full calculation of it. He went on, "When you said why wait a year and walked out, you destroyed my entire plan. And then when you filed for divorce and the financial documents became public, you destroyed the house of cards I'd built over a decade. I hated you for it at first, but sitting here now, I realize you did me a favor. I would have kept going, kept escalating until the crash was even worse. You forced me to face consequences before I dug a hole I couldn't climb out of." The letter ended, "I don't know what my life will be after this, but I know you'll continue building yours, and it will be extraordinary. You always had something I didn't, the ability to create real value instead of just the appearance of it. I'm sorry I tried to destroy that in you. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." I folded the letter, put it in a drawer, and never read it again. It wasn't that I was unmoved by his apology. It seemed genuine, as far as that mattered now.
But I learned something important. Closure doesn't come from someone else admitting they were wrong. It comes from knowing yourself well enough that their wrongness no longer defines your story. By November, exactly 1 year after everything changed, I'd opened 5 boutiques, doubled my revenue, then featured in Vogue Italia's Women Reshaping Italian Business issue, and successfully launched my accessible line that sold out within weeks. I stood in my flagship store on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by pieces I'd designed, in a space I'd created, building something that would outlast any relationship. Kiara found me there, looking contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I smiled. "I'm thinking that a year ago, I was sitting at a dinner table listening to my husband announce I was on trial. And now he's actually on trial, and I'm here doing exactly what I want. Life is strange." She laughed. "Strange, but fair. You earned all of this, Alina. Every bit of it." I believed her. For the first time in my adult life, I fully believed I deserved my success, not because someone granted it to me or allowed it, but because I'd built it with my own vision and work. That evening, I had dinner with a few close friends at a restaurant in Brera. We talked about upcoming collections, about travel plans, about a new artist one of them had discovered. Nobody asked about Matteo or the divorce or any of it. I'd become more than that story. I was just Elena, designer and friend and complex human, with a past, but also a future that had nothing to do with who I'd once been married to. Walking home that night through Milan's streets, I passed the building where Matteo and I lived together. I looked up at our old terrace, someone else's home now, and tried to remember the woman who'd lived there, who tolerated slow erosion of her self-worth in exchange for the appearance of a perfect marriage. She felt like someone I'd known once but had lost touch with, replaced by this newer, clearer version of myself. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just building a life so completely your own that the person who hurt you becomes irrelevant to it. And I'd done exactly that. What do you owe someone who tried to make you smaller? Forgiveness, or just the gift of your absence from their life?
By the spring of my second year post-divorce, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Early mornings at the studio, afternoons in meetings or with clients, evenings that might include business dinners or might just be quiet time in my apartment with a good book and wine. The frenetic energy of the previous year, building, expanding, proving something, had calmed into steady, confident growth. I was in Paris for Fashion Week when I got the news that Matteo was being released early for good behavior. He'd served 2 years of his 6-year sentence, and with various reductions, he was getting out. Francesca called to tell me, thinking I'd want to know. "Does he have any restrictions?" I asked. "Parole, monitoring, that sort of thing?" She confirmed he'd be supervised, couldn't leave Italy, couldn't work in finance or consulting. "Are you worried?" she asked. I considered it honestly. No, I realized. He can't hurt me anymore. Whatever power he had over me evaporated the moment I chose to leave. She made a sound of approval. "That's growth, Alina. 2 years ago, this news would have shaken you." She was right. 2 years ago, I still cared what he thought, what he might do, how his story intersected with mine. Now, he was just someone I used to know. The Paris shows were extraordinary that year. My collection received standing ovations, and I secured partnerships with major department stores in 3 countries. At the celebratory dinner afterward, surrounded by models and buyers and other designers, someone asked about my success. "What's your secret?" they wanted to know. "How did you build all this so fast?" I thought about it, swirling wine in my glass. "I stopped shrinking," I said finally. "I stopped making myself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Turns out, when you take up the space you actually need, you can build remarkable things." The table went quiet for a moment. Then someone raised their glass. "To not shrinking," they toasted. We all drank to that.
Back in Milan, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Matteo had moved back to the city, was living in a modest apartment near Stazione Centrale, working at a friend's restaurant while he figured out his next steps. The Santoro family had apparently forgiven him enough to provide minimal support, but nothing resembling his former lifestyle. He'd tried to reach out to old business contacts, but most wanted nothing to do with him. His name was still mud in professional circles. I occasionally wondered if I'd see him around the city. Milan is big, but certain neighborhoods are small. It finally happened on a warm May afternoon. I was walking through Parco Sempone with Chiara, discussing plans for a fall photo shoot, when I spotted him sitting on a bench near the Castello. He looked older, thinner, his expensive clothes replaced by ordinary jeans and a simple shirt. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other across the distance of the park path. Then he stood, uncertain, and I could see him deciding whether to approach me. I paused, curious what I would feel in this moment. Anger? Satisfaction? Regret? But what I actually felt was simply nothing. No strong emotion at all. He was just a person I used to be married to, someone from my past who no longer had any power over my present. I nodded slightly, not friendly but acknowledging his existence, and kept walking. I didn't stop, didn't speak to him, didn't create an opportunity for whatever he might have wanted to say. Chiara, who knew the whole story, glanced back at him. "Was that hard?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. Not even a little bit. I think that's how I know I'm really done, when seeing him is no more significant than seeing any stranger. That summer, I made a decision that felt like the final piece of my transformation. I'd been approached by a publisher about writing a book, not about the divorce or Matteo's crimes, but about building a business in one of the world's most competitive fashion cities. They wanted practical advice, personal stories, the real experience of a woman who had created success on her own terms. At first, I'd hesitated. Writing a book felt vulnerable, exposed, like inviting the world into my thinking and my history. But then I realized that was exactly why I should do it. The old Elena had hidden, had kept herself small and private and careful. The new Elena understood that sharing her story, the real story, including the failures and the fears, might help other women who were in similar positions.
I spent 6 months working on it, writing late into the evenings after long days at the studio. The book wasn't just about business strategy or design philosophy, though it included both. It was about recognizing your worth, setting boundaries, walking away from situations that diminish you. It was about the courage it takes to end something familiar in favor of something unknown but potentially better. When Built, Not Given, Creating Success on Your Own Terms was published the following spring, the response exceeded anything I'd imagined. It became a bestseller in Italy, was translated into 12 languages, and led to speaking engagements across Europe. Women came up to me at events with stories about leaving bad marriages, quitting soul-crushing jobs, starting businesses they'd been afraid to attempt. "You gave me permission," one woman said at a signing in Rome. "Permission to prioritize myself, to believe I deserved better." I thought about that phrase, permission. How often had I waited for permission from Matteo, from society, from some external authority before making decisions about my own life? The most powerful thing I'd learned was that the only permission you really need is your own. Through it all, the business continued growing. More stores, more collaborations, a diffusion line that made my designs accessible to women at every price point. I hired more staff, mentored young designers, created an internship program specifically for women from underrepresented backgrounds. I built not just a company, but something closer to a movement, proving that success doesn't require sacrificing your values or yourself. 3 years after the divorce, I was invited to speak at an event for women entrepreneurs in Milan. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I thought about the woman I'd been at that awful dinner party. How small she'd felt. How close she'd come to accepting Matteo's narrative that she was the problem, that her ambition was too much, that she needed to be tested and evaluated to see if she was worth keeping. The person who tried to diminish me most was someone who claimed to love me. And for too long, I let him. I made myself smaller, quieter, less ambitious to preserve a marriage that was already broken. The day I stopped doing that, the day I chose myself over his comfort, my entire life changed. I continued. Revenge would have been pointing out his flaws, trying to hurt him the way he hurt me. But what I did instead was refuse to carry his secrets. I refused to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. And then I built something so completely mine that his opinion became irrelevant. That's not revenge. That's just freedom. The applause was overwhelming, but what struck me most was the conversation afterward. Women lined up to talk to me, to share their own stories of leaving difficult situations, choosing themselves, rebuilding. I realized that what I'd lived through, the public humiliation, the painful revelation of betrayal, the difficult choice to walk away, wasn't unique to me. It was the story of countless women who'd been taught to shrink, to accommodate, to prioritize others' comfort over their own dignity. My story had just happened to be public, documented, impossible to hide. And in that visibility, other women had seen something that gave them courage for their own invisible battles. That evening, I went home to my apartment, still the same one in Porta Venenza, though I'd slowly filled it with art and furniture that felt like mine, creating a space that reflected exactly who I'd become. I poured a glass of wine, stood on my small terrace, and looked out at Milan, the city that had witnessed both my worst moments and my greatest triumphs. Somewhere in this city, Matteo was probably having a similar evening, though his circumstances were dramatically different. I didn't wish him harm, didn't think about him often, didn't carry any of the anger or hurt that had once consumed me. He'd become a cautionary tale in business circles, a name people remembered as an example of what happens when you build success on deception. But I'd become something else, an example of resilience, of the power of choosing yourself, of what's possible when you stop waiting for permission to take up space in your own life. It wasn't the story I'd expected to live when I married him 10 years ago, full of hope and love and naive trust, but it was, unexpectedly, a much better story than the one I'd originally planned. Because the version of myself I discovered on the other side of that betrayal, the woman who could walk away from a public humiliation with dignity, who could rebuild an entire life with intention, who could turn pain into purpose and disappointment into determination, she was someone worth becoming. And I'd found her not through revenge, but through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to be anyone other than exactly who I was. The best revenge, I'd learned, isn't revenge at all. It's just success so complete, so authentic, so entirely your own that the past becomes irrelevant to your present. And I'd achieved exactly that. When someone tries to write you out of your own story, what's the most powerful response? Rewriting them out of yours?
5 years have passed since that November dinner party when my then-husband announced I was on trial. 5 years since I walked out of my own home and into a life I didn't yet know I could build. Looking back now, I can see how every moment of pain was actually a doorway, though I certainly couldn't see it at the time. All I knew then was that I couldn't stay, couldn't continue shrinking, couldn't accept being evaluated by someone who'd stopped valuing me years before. Today, Elena Rossi Design operates in 17 cities across Europe, Asia, and North America. We employ over 200 people. My accessible line has made quality design available to millions of women who'd never been able to afford high fashion before. I've won industry awards, been featured in documentaries about Italian business success stories, spoken at universities about entrepreneurship and resilience. The numbers are impressive, yes, but they're not what I'm most proud of. What I'm most proud of is simpler. I like who I am now. I wake up in the morning and don't check to see if someone else approves of my plans for the day. I make decisions based on what feels right, not on maintaining an image of perfection. I've learned to be comfortable with being alone, which paradoxically has made my relationships with friends, family, and business partners deeper and more authentic. When you stop needing validation from someone who withholds it, you suddenly have so much more energy for people who genuinely care about you. I still live in Milan, still love this complicated, beautiful city where appearance matters almost as much as substance. But I've found a way to exist here on my own terms. My apartment in Porta Venezia is no longer temporary. I've made it home. My studio in Brera has expanded to include a gallery space where I showcase other Italian designers, helping them the way I wish someone had helped me earlier in my career. On Sunday mornings, I walk through the city without makeup or designer clothes. Just Elena in jeans and a sweater, buying vegetables at the market, and feeling perfectly content. Matteo, from what I understand through the few mutual acquaintances we still have, has rebuilt a modest life. He works in restaurant management, stays out of the public eye, lives quietly. I hope he's found some peace. Honestly, I do. Not because I've forgiven him. I'm not even sure forgiveness is the right framework for what happened between us, but because I've released him. His life and choices no longer affect mine in any meaningful way. We're just two people who once shared a marriage, who hurt each other in different ways, who went on to build very different futures. Sometimes people ask if I regret staying as long as I did, if I wish I'd seen the signs earlier. The truth is, I don't think about it in terms of regret. That marriage, difficult as it was, taught me crucial things about myself. It showed me my capacity for endurance, yes, but also my breaking point. It revealed patterns I'd learned in childhood about accommodating others at my own expense. And ultimately, it forced me to become strong enough to choose myself, even when that choice came with consequences. The dinner party that changed everything. I think about it occasionally, especially when I'm working with young designers who are just starting out. I tell them, watch for the people who diminish you under the guise of love or concern. Notice when someone's support feels conditional on you staying small. And understand that walking away from those situations isn't failure. It's the beginning of success on your own terms. I've had relationships since the divorce, though nothing I've wanted to formalize into marriage. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm also not seeking it. I've learned I'm perfectly complete on my own, and any partnership I enter now would need to add to my life rather than define it. I'm not afraid of being alone. I'm afraid of losing myself again, of compromising the clarity I've earned through hard experience. Last week, I received an invitation to speak at an event in New York about women in business. The organizer mentioned that other speakers included several women I admire, leaders in their fields who'd overcome significant challenges. As I was accepting the invitation, I realized something. I'm one of those women now, too. Not because I'm perfect or have all the answers, but because I lived through something difficult and came out the other side more myself than before. That younger Elena, the one who smiled through casual cruelty and wondered if she maybe was too ambitious, too focused, too much, I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now, that her ambition was exactly right, that her focus would build something remarkable, that being too much for someone who wanted her small was actually being exactly enough for herself. But I couldn't tell her. She had to live through it, make the hard choices, discover her own strength the way we all do, through necessity, through pain, through the moment you realize staying would destroy you more surely than leaving ever could. This morning, I stood in my flagship store in Milan, the one I opened 3 years ago. Early sunlight was streaming through the windows, illuminating the clothes displayed with care, the space I designed to reflect both strength and elegance. A young woman came in, nervous, clutching a portfolio of design sketches. She wanted advice, wanted to know how to start. I sat with her, looked at her work, and told her the truth. You're talented. The talent isn't enough. You need to be willing to take up space, to believe you deserve success as much as anyone else, to walk away from situations that make you smaller. She nodded, absorbing this. Then she asked, "How do you know when it's time to walk away?" I thought about that question, about the answer I wish someone had given me years ago. I said, "You know it's time when staying costs you more than leaving would, when you start losing parts of yourself to maintain something that's already broken, when you realize you're protecting someone else's comfort at the expense of your own dignity." She left with tears in her eyes and something that looked like determination on her face. I hope she doesn't wait as long as I did, but if she does, I hope she finds the same strength I found, not in revenge or bitterness, but in the simple, revolutionary act of choosing herself. When I look in the mirror now, I see someone I recognize and respect. Someone who's made mistakes, who's been hurt and has hurt others, who's imperfect and complicated and real, but also someone who refused to stay in a story that was diminishing her. Someone who built a life that feels authentic rather than performed. Someone who learned that the opposite of being diminished isn't being elevated by someone else, it's standing at your full height on your own. That's not the story I thought I was living when I married Matteo Santoro in a beautiful ceremony overlooking Lake Como. But it's a better story, a truer story. My story, not anyone else's version of what my story should be.
If this story touched your heart and you'd like to support this work, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every small gesture helps bring more stories like this one to life. Thank you for listening, and remember, your kindness makes stories possible.